Don't mock. I'm not a fool. Don't mock. I'm not a fool.
I just think that would be fun.
Hey there, and welcome to episode 104 of the Dumb Leaders podcast. My name's Tony Curl, and today I'm discussing confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is something that plagues each and every one of us. And we need to be aware of it because it shapes our worldviews, it shapes our thoughts and our beliefs. And often, as I'll go through, there's been some research conducted in and around confirmation bias that is really quite frightening around the prospect of what it takes to change it. So first up, I'm going to share a real-life example of what's happening in the world right now. Now, the news as such, in as plain and simple language, presently, there is a post-election audit being completed in Arizona. Now, the Arizona State Senate used its subpoena power to take possession of all 2.1 million ballots in Maricopa County and the machines that counted them, along with computer hard drives filled with data. Now, the audit is being conducted by a Florida company called Ninja. That's the news. That's the simple facts around the process that is happening right now in Arizona. Now, depending on what news sources you tune into, you would have heard some of the following, right? And I'm just going to make these statements and you can work through what news outlets are potentially the ones that are sharing this information. So this audit will indicate fraud of a massive scale. This unprecedented audit is undermining the democratic process. This audit will lead to more audits in more states. The man who owns the company has posted and shared unfounded conspiracy theories around election results. The Democrats attempted to legally stop the audit from taking place. Why would the Democrats stop it if it didn't have anything to hide? Okay, so there's about 7 different statements there, and they all are sharing a different narrative. So depending on what you tune into, depending on what you watch, you are listening to a narrative and an opinion piece more so than just the facts. But these narratives and opinion pieces form the foundations of our beliefs and what we see as the facts. It's the narrative. And this is how our opinion, each and every one of us, our opinion is being formed. And the interesting thing when you read dissenting views, unless in many cases if there's some influencing factors in there like facts and figures, we usually discount them to our way of thought or it confirms to us the stupidity of the other side because there's always my side and the other side. And this is what we see with confirmation bias. Now, when I go to the social networks, I've read some of the news stuff that's occurring around this thing that's happening right now in Maricopa County in Arizona. But you go to, say, a social network, and I'm going to go to Twitter, and just within the first 10, a very quick, simple search under the term audit, right? So we've got one tweet. The Arizona audit continues uninterrupted, and there's a link to a press site called Citizen Free Press. So that's probably not what I would consider a major newsworthy thing, but anyway, I'm not quite sure how much integrity that particular Citizen Free Press has, and then at the end after the link, it's bet some leftists are not happy. And then the very next tweet, what audit? Oh, you mean that fake one that won't come to anything? Trump lost Arizona. You realize that, right? Their Secretary of State certified the election. It's done. Another tweet. With the audit going on in Arizona and you want us to focus on the Myanmar Focus on what will happen when Biden's administration will be no more, because the army will take over. An audit performed by a company that pushed conspiracy theories during and after the election and has never done an election audit before. No removal of black pens from the tables examining the ballots, only one news outlet observing. What could go wrong here? The new audit led by Trump, fixed by Trump, all to validate Trump's lies. Thank you, and this is a tweet that's quoting a quote. Thank you, state senators and others in Arizona, for commencing this full forensic audit, the former president said in a statement. I predict the results will be startling. And this particular person then says, I predict the same. It will be pure bullshit, but I predict it for sure. And then the final one that I'll share is that I guess my point is that it's just a rehash of what's already out there. You're not in touch with reality. There's not much that can be done. The audit will mean next to nothing in the end other than to give Q nuts a few jollies. So, once again, take any of that for what it is. I mean, that's the reality of the situation over there on Twitter. You have one side and you have the other side. And no matter what's posted, the influence and people's opinions are definitely not changing. But I do think it's dangerous, right? So even in a situation like this, if this was an audit that has been subpoenaed by the state Senate, which is largely Republican, if that is the case and you want that audit to be seen as having some integrity, I don't understand why you would then leak some stuff. You know, like I've seen some posts. Now, I don't know the validity of the posts, obviously, but I've seen some posts with some figures already coming out of the audit. So an audit's an audit. You wait till the audit's finished prior to posting any sort of results. So any presumption or any, results that are talked about along the way probably indicates that maybe the audit won't be sent. Well, I tend to think that the results from the audit are going to be dismissed anyway. I mean, ultimately, it is what it is. So, and the reality is it's going to continue. But I suppose you've got a large proportion of the American population, and when I say large, I'm not saying it's the majority view. I'm just saying there is still a large percentage of people that would indicate that they believe that the election was largely fraudulent. I mean, I would suggest that there are certainly some discrepancies that need to be looked at. But it's like that whole concept of the election discrepancies. You either believe it's fraud or you believe the election officials who tell us that there was no fraud. And by saying that, that's the debunking done, you know. So once formed, now this is interesting. When we start going into research in and around confirmation bias, once formed, impressions are remarkably perseverant. So I'll just repeat that. Once formed, impressions are remarkably perseverant, and we see this time and time and time again. So if we're talking election discrepancies, we're talking a group of people who believe it was fraud and a group of people who believe that it was secure and safe. So, and no matter what's presented, and this is the really challenging thing when it comes to bias, confirmation bias, is that our opinions are largely and remarkably perseverant, right? And we stick to them, even if there is proof to the contrary, even if there's facts and figures observing something else. So once formed, impressions are remarkably perseverant. Now, confirmation bias, just as a quick matter of taking a couple of backward steps, I suppose, there is the tendency for people have to embrace information that supports their beliefs and reject information that contradicts them. So this is what confirmation bias is. Studies on this have concluded, right? So there's been numerous studies on confirmation bias, on the world of biases as they play out. So, but studies have concluded that, and I'll quote, providing people with accurate information doesn't seem to help. They simply discount it. Appealing to their emotions may work better, but doing so is obviously opposite to the goal of promoting sound science. The challenge that remains, they write, is to figure out how to address the tendencies that lead to false scientific beliefs. So that was one of the studies that I researched prior to this. So providing people with accurate information doesn't seem to help. They simply discount it. And we see this time and time again. An article in BBC World suggests that confirmation bias is okay as long as we're right. But all too often we're wrong, and we only pay attention to this deciding evidence when it's too late. So that's another interesting thing. So confirmatory evidence strengthens people's views. So evidence that confirms with our belief and our way of thinking strengthens our views. But as you'd expect, but so did the evidence that actually contradicts our views. It actually strengthens our views. So it's a really compelling thing to dive into when we're talking about human nature. Now, in one experiment, people with strong for and against views on, say, the subject was the death penalty. So they've got a group of people. Some are strongly for, some are strongly against, and it's the subject being the death penalty. So in one of the studies that they conducted, they asked the participants in this group to be fair and unbiased. Right, that was the brief, to be fair and unbiased, and it was all about the concept of the experiment was in relation to the death penalty. So guess what the result was? So we've asked people to be fair and unbiased, and the result was ultimately remarkably similar to what their original views were, right? So they're asked to be fair and unbiased, so if they had a pro-death penalty, remarkably similar to their original views, as in the contrasting thing where people were against the death penalty. Once again, the experiment at the end, the result was that the remarkably similar to their original views. Now, why? Why would you think that would be the case? Most people naturally assume that their thoughts are already unbiased and right. So that's why. I mean, so when someone who believes that they're right is asked to be fair and unbiased, they're probably not going to necessarily look towards the other side. They're going to believe in their own what they see as their own unbiased views, right? But in another study conducted during this experiment, they asked participants to consider the opposite. Consider the opposite stance or view. And and once again, this is interesting. This is really interesting. The consider the opposite participants, on the other hand, completely overcame their biased assimilation effect. Wow. Completely overcame the biased assimilation effect. They weren't driven to rate the studies which agreed with their preconceptions as better than the ones that disagreed, and didn't become more extreme in their views, regardless of which evidence they read. Now, the finding was I suppose, some good news. Some good news. It isn't that we don't want to discover the truth. This is what the study particularly reasoned. It isn't that we don't want to discover the truth. All people needed was a strategy which helped them overcome the natural human short-sightedness to the alternatives. So all it needed was a strategy. Now, the moral for making better decisions is clear. Once again, I'm reading from the findings from the research. Wanting to be fair and objective just isn't enough. It isn't enough to be wanting to be fair and objective. What's needed are practical methods for correcting our limited reasoning, and a major limitation is our imagination for how things might be. So if we're lucky, someone else will point out these alternatives, but if we're on our own, we can still take advantage of this by asking ourselves, now consider the opposite. Consider the opposite. Now, as a coach, I know many coaches will ask their clients what else could be true. Questions like this. So have you considered it from the what if that was actually the case? So a lot of coaches dive into this sort of stuff when they're working with people. But the reality is if you're on your own and you're reading something that confirms your bias, maybe you've got to ask yourself, well, what if the opposite was true? And really start to take that on board to fight confirmation bias, because all we're seeing in the world is one confirmation bias fighting another one, and while that may make people feel great about themselves, typing away on the keyboard, it's really ultimately not necessarily challenging. So listen, be curious, consider the opposite. So forcing your opinion onto others just strengthens their stance and their viewpoint. I've been saying this for a while. Insults do not influence. So forcing your opinion onto others just strengthens their stance and their viewpoint. Ask them to consider the opposite, and that's a strategy where you can actually influence. And of course, the biggest person to influence is actually yourself. Hey, thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Dumb Leaders Podcast. I shall see you next time. Bye for now.
Don't mock. I'm not a fool. And people who know me personally know that I am not a fool. But I won't get into the details of those. I just want people to realize that I'm not a fool. Don't mock. I'm not a fool. Don't mock. I'm not a fool.